Hello everyone and welcome to this new episode of Small Talk. I'm really glad to have with me Mr. Chris Richardson. Hi Richard. Hi Chris.
Hi there. How's it going?
All good. We were just talking with Chris about Europe having like some time off in summer, and as you can see from what I just said, looks like that. A bit confused with names and stuff, but we'll sort it out. Don't worry.
Yeah. What I want to know is why were the snowflakes going up instead of down in that little video clip?
It's a good question for StreamYard. Excellent. So thanks, Chris, for taking the time for being with us. We are here with Small Talk, as you all know, or you might not know. This is a format by Avance Coperta where with our trainers, we aim to explore the topics of their upcoming workshop. In particular, in this case, we are here with Chris as he will be coming to Italy for the first time. Am I right, Chris?
That actually,
will be the first time.
First time? No. Well, yeah.
Teaching the workshop, I mean.
Times on vacation.
Exactly. There you go.
In fact, the last time I came to Italy for work was in the last century.
Wow. So if we, usually talk about pre-COVID times, here it's pre-2000 time, but yeah, so let's say first time.
Yeah, in fact, it was actually before the web.
Wow, long time ago. Well, then glad to have you back with us in Milan. That will happen in November for his 3-day workshop called Designing Microservices. And so today we are here to find out everything about it. But of course, not everything, because we'd like to have you in the classroom with us in Milan next November. But today, if you have questions, that's the right time to ask. We'll be reading questions from the chat on YouTube and LinkedIn down here. So feel free to ask away during our chat. We'll be here for about 45 minutes with Chris. So there's going to be plenty of time and room for interaction. Now, Chris, well, welcome again. Would you like to introduce us your workshop? So we're talking about designing microservices.
Yeah.
It's a 3-day in-person experience.
Yeah. So as you can guess from the name, I mean, it's about designing microservices. And specifically, it introduces a process, a sequence of design activities with deliverables for designing a microservice architecture. And it's not about sort of technologies like Docker, Kubernetes, and Kafka, and a lot of the things that we traditionally associate with microservices, for one simple reason. Technology is important, but it's not the hard problem that you have to solve when using microservices. I mean, the key thing that you have to do that will determine the success or failure of your development efforts is to design a service architecture. So identify services, define their responsibilities and their APIs, and then design the distributed operations or requests that span multiple services. Including applying the service collaboration patterns appropriately, like Saga, API composition, and CQRS. Because that's sort of that is the key challenge that you will face when using microservices. And if you get it wrong, in the worst case, you can create a distributed monolith, which combines the complexity of a distributed architecture with all of the friction of a monolithic architecture. And so instead of accelerating software delivery, it will actually make it way worse, and you can end up in a world of pain.
Wow. We don't want that, right? The aim of the workshop is to actually solve some pain rather than creating new ones.
Yes, yeah. So it's all about, how to, I mean, in a sense, it's about, first off, figure out, is the microservice architecture a good fit for my application? Do I have the complexity and the team size that warrants using microservices, or should you stick with the monolithic architecture? And then if microservices are a good fit, how to, in the workshop, you learn how to design a good microservice architecture. And the workshop's targeted at sort of senior developers, enterprise, kind of like, I want to say enterprise Java, but C#, .NET, it's pretty language neutral, technology neutral. So people who are building enterprise applications, architects, CTOs, VPs of engineering, who either want to use microservices or thinking about it, or are in the middle of using it and want to do better at it.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Chris. I already see a few patterns, no pun intended, that we're going to follow through this conversation. One of them is the importance of it not being purely technical. So it's not about the technology itself, but more about the overall thing. The other one, and I thank Marco Heims of Hi thanks Marco for being with us, another one of our trainers, for the first questions, the question that we're going to read during this live. Please be like Marco, ask a lot, and let's make this interactive. Hi, Marco. So he asks, how does API composition relate to CQRS and microservice architecture?
Oh, yeah. So in a microservice architecture, it's comprised of multiple services, 2 or more. And as a result, some operations or requests will span multiple services. So in order to implement them, you need to use what I call the service collaboration patterns. And there's 4 patterns, 2 for implementing commands which mutate data, and 2 patterns for implementing queries that retrieve data. And this question actually asks about API composition and CQRS, which are the 2 patterns for querying data in a microservice architecture. So the problem you're trying to solve is something like find order history, which has to query a bunch of services, right? The order service, restaurant service, delivery service, so on and so forth, and gather data from all of them. So API composition, super simple pattern where that query is implemented by retrieving data, issuing subqueries to retrieve data from the services that own it, and then merging the results together and returning it to the client, the browser, or whatever. Whereas CQRS actually maintains a replica of the data gathered from multiple services designed specifically to answer that and perhaps other related queries. And the services that own the data publish events that trigger the update of the quote replica so that it can be queried. And so those are the 2 patterns, and there's just different trade-offs associated with each one. Like API composition, super simple, but it might not be efficient. So you might want to use CQRS, but then you've got the cost and the complexity of replication and the fact that updates are delayed and so on and so forth. So those are all kinds of things. There's sort of the trade-offs with each of the patterns is kind of one of the key topics in the workshop.
Nice. Good one. Thanks, Chris. So Marco, let us know if that answered the question, and if not, happy to read more from you.
No, come to the workshop.
As well, of course. Something tells me it might be coming. Well, let's see.
Yeah.
Awesome. So thanks, Chris. Right. So when we talk about microservices, it's always, one of those buzzwords that's been around for, well, a number of years now. Your work is clearly fundamental into this. So do you think, are they still in their moment of hype somehow, or is it like kind of fading? How do you see the implementation of microservices in the overall scenario?
Well, I would say that it's sort of like every technology kind of goes through this hype cycle, right? and it rushes up to the peak of inflated expectations where people, well, as the name suggests, people just think it's truly amazing and it obviously has no downsides. But obviously all technologies do, and then it plunges to the trough of disillusionment where, oh, it's terrible, blah, 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 blah. And then after that, you've got the sort of the plateau of enlightenment followed by the plateau of productivity. And I guess I would say, and to getting to the plateau of productivity where you understand the trade-offs associated with a technology and knowing when to use it is really the ideal state. And I would say that microservices, I think it's past its peak of inflated expectations. And there's a fair amount of sort of people write about how the pendulum has swung the other way. And so, yeah, if you post, I mean, this has been true for a while now. If you post, I could post a really insightful tweet about microservices, and it gets, the level of engagement is okay. It's okay. Whereas if I say something good about monoliths, wow, the engagement is off the charts, right? But and interestingly, I actually wrote about this 10, 11 years ago, talking about the Gartner hype cycle of microservices. And I've sort of always viewed my mission as to actually fight against the hype and the anti-hype and move developers to the plateau of productivity as quickly as possible so that they know when to use it and when not to, and also how to use it effectively as well. Because, yeah, I mean, it's sort of my area of expertise, but on the other hand, it's like, it's a tool and you have to, and you use it when it's appropriate, and you should not use it when it's not appropriate.
Very interesting and insightful, and that leads me to another question, which is what you just referred to as in the, how to say, dichotomy, microservices versus monolith, which is actually not, a fight. Sometimes it's okay to have monolith, right? And some other times the microservices, no, it's not like one or the other, or one is the absolute best and one the absolute worst.
Well, it's like, what is better, a bicycle or an airplane? Right?
Depends where you have to go, right?
Right. I mean, I feel like in the software community, we get very polarized, where it's like planes, that's all you should use. Bikes suck, or bikes, that's all you should use. Planes suck, right? There's literally this suck rock dichotomy where it's like my technology rocks and your technology sucks, and vice versa, right? Whereas in reality, it's like I use a bike to, I don't know, get exercise around my neighborhood, but I'm not going to go to Europe on my bicycle, right?
Absolutely.
I could try, I suppose, but
you can try, exactly. There's a quote from one of our trainers. He also does a workshop on microservices, is Gianluca Padovani, and he said that, basically, for all that gets said about the monolith, he's like, or she, a person who is not well. So don't fight against the monolith just because it's something you need to go against too. It's just something that is there. You might still want to use it. Don't throw away, kind of thing. So I think what you just said goes in that direction as well.
Yeah, I mean, that 10 years ago now, I created the microservice architecture pattern language. And I think in the very beginning, there were 3 patterns: monolith, microservices, and API gateway. I think that was the first release of the pattern language. And it was like, by definition, the monolith is a pattern. It's not an anti-pattern. And so it's got benefits, drawbacks, and times when you should use it, just like microservices. And in a way, I feel like I've spent a lot of the past 10 years trying to refine the criteria of when you should use one versus the other, and then the trade-offs associated with each one of those.
Because as you wrote also, it's all a big, it depends. It's all about the trade-offs and what you need to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So next question from Elite Man. Thank you very much. Which says, does a database have to be a microservice in its own? Did I get it right a little? Yeah, that's what's here. So
yeah, that's an interesting question for a couple of different reasons. So it's sort of two defining one of the defining characteristics of the microservice architecture is that services must be loosely coupled. And there's a few different meanings to that word, but the relevant one here is loosely design time coupled, which means that changes to one service should not regularly cause changes, should not require changes to be made to other services. And a key part of loose coupling, of loose design time coupling, is basically services not sharing database schemas, because that would introduce tight design time coupling. So the schema is basically an implementation detail of a service, which you should be free to change without having to coordinate with the 10 other teams whose services are using the same database schema as yours. So it's sort of like a database schema per service, and ideally, to maximize sort of loose coupling, you should have a dedicated database server. Though that's not a hard requirement, it's just convenient from an operational perspective. One service cannot overload a shared database and perform essentially a denial of service attack on the other services. So that's some background. And the interesting thing is this concept, the question is the wording is interesting about, does a database have to be a service? And so in my mind, in a microservice architecture, you have services which are kind of like well-designed domain objects, a mixture of behavior, as in business logic, and data, as in a database schema. So I wouldn't have a database and stick a REST API on it to make it into a service. That's very likely to be an anti-pattern. Primarily around reasons of design time coupling and lack of encapsulation, because you're basically exposing the database in its entirety as a REST API. And if I'm interpreting the question directly.
Awesome. Correct. Thanks, Chris. And let's see if we have some clarifications, or if that's enough as it is. So let's go back for a second to what we are actually going to do during the workshop in Milan. As I mentioned, that will be on the 20th, 21st, and 22nd of November. I'll just quickly share the webpage. Ta-da! Just in case you were wondering, that's where you can find all the information, the schedule about the workshop. Now, you mentioned before the workshop won't be based on a specific language. And one of the questions we always do is, so how are we, well, not so how are we, but in general, how is the theory versus practice part of the workshop going to work?
Oh, yeah.
So what are we going to do for 3 days together?
So yeah, there's certainly lectures, because so basically sort of the overall format of the workshop is I walk you through the 5 steps of the design process. The 5 steps are discovering system operations, designing subdomains, defining a service architecture, evaluating said service architecture, and refactoring. So those are the 5 sort of activities. And we're basically just going to go through that design process for an example application. And at the start of each phase, there's going to have lecture plus discussion introducing this is what you're going to do. But then the bulk of the time is actually getting together in small groups, essentially roughly 4 teams, and doing the design exercise, either literally on paper or if you want on a Miro board or whatever medium you want to use. I've even had people in workshops using like spreadsheets as design documents, which sounds strange, but it definitely worked for them. And then we get together, and then another really valuable thing happens. We review the design and talk about it in detail. So it's sort of the format is lecture, design exercise, review, iterate until we're done, basically.
Awesome. Yeah, can't wait for that, really. So, folks, if you're interested, get your tickets, and hopefully we'll see you there.
And I should say that, yes, Post-it notes can be used for this too.
Of course. Otherwise, it's no Advanced Coperta workshop.
Not quite as many as Alberto, but
of course,
you can use a fair number of them.
That's a middle ground, right? Somewhere
Yes.
in between. Right. So, Chris, as you mentioned, of course, it's not only about doing workshops, but you're also renowned for your books, especially the microservice book. So, any tips or funny story or interesting story about how the book came about, or something you want to share about the process of writing a book, which is definitely a challenge of some sort?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I mean, it's funny. There's some Microservices Patterns, and that came out in 2018. That was my second book, and the first one was Pojos in Action, all about Spring and Hibernate, back in 2006. And I don't know why, for some reason, starting in early 2000s, I sort of had this desire to write a book. I even started drafting a completely different book about web frameworks, or web as in HTTP, and framework for doing that for some strange reason. So I had this strange desire to write a book. And then the first one actually ended up taking 4 years. And I think I virtually had post-traumatic stress syndrome. It was so, it was such a painful process. I mean, I liken writing a book to climbing Mount Everest, right? Where, it might seem fun at first, but then you get to 20,000 feet where it's freezing cold, you're starting to get frostbite, and you can barely function because the oxygen level is really low. But you've invested so much in it that you can't quit. It is just a truly stressful experience. And that was the first time. The second time, I guess maybe I spent 2 years writing the book, and it was a lot less stressful, but to a certain extent, the Mount Everest
was still there.
Sort of analogy applies.
Wow. Okay. So the other.
Yeah. But I did not suffer from like PTSD the second time around. I could actually open the book and look at it without getting an anxiety attack.
That's awesome. That's a good improvement. And is there anything else in the works as a third book, or apart from the one you mentioned, which?
Well, very unofficially, I'm sort of kind of in super early stages of thinking about the second edition for Microservices Patterns, between you and me.
Of course. We are just the two of us now.
Who knows?
Okay. And would it be an updated edition or some new content, or?
Well, if you think about it, I wrote. The Microservices Patterns was written from over like 2016, 2017, 2018. And what's really cool about it is that the core patterns have not changed, but obviously some aspects of technology have changed. Like I feel like Kubernetes has sort of become much more mature and so on. Though surprisingly, a lot of stuff, the concepts have not changed a huge amount. But in reality, like I feel like I've changed a lot. And like say this process that I'm teaching in this workshop, that was developed after the book. So in the book, I just sort of, just kind of have a few pages dedicated to process.
Okay.
Whereas, now I've got quite a rich body of work around this design process. So there's a lot of just, quite a few years of kind of conceptual improvements that can be incorporated.
Sounds like a lot of meaningful content in addition, so can't wait for it.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Awesome.
One day, I don't know if people know, I guess a lot of people know Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? British, actually it started off as a British radio drama, comedy. And one of the quotes from the author, Douglas Adams, is, "I love deadlines. I like the noise they make when they go whooshing by."
I like this one. This is perfect.
Yeah. I think that's another, my publisher doesn't like that quote quite as much.
Of course. Good stuff. Thanks, Chris. So we're going to the end of this chat with Chris. If folks have any last minute question, that's the time to ask away. I also had a question about feedback about the approach. So what are folks saying about it? So you usually get called into companies to do transformations in moving from monolith to microservices, or not anymore, and in general, how are people reacting to this? So what's behind it, and that on a team level and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose sort of in a nutshell, I mean, I've been teaching this workshop for a while now. And then some of the core concepts from the workshop, I've been talking about those even longer. Particularly the dark energy, dark matter concepts, and which is sort of the 10 criteria that you can use to evaluate the suitability of a design. And in general, the feedback has always been positive, like sort of in a sense, this is provides a good framework for thinking about design, right? So, I mean, which I think is at the core of it, like in a sense, kind of the key message is, it depends, right? And then the next thing is, well, what does it depend upon? And then, well, it tends to depend upon these 10 criteria: dark energy, dark matter. And so, overall, it just provides people with a great way of thinking about the numerous design decisions that they need to make when designing a microservice architecture, and avoid the trap of simply defining lots of tiny little services, which is kind of the myth that is associated with the microservice architecture.
Nice. I was looking for the article where you mentioned that, so I can post it to folks, but I guess I'll do it later on, and that's all good. All righty, Chris. So I just mentioned your article, and you actually mentioned your article. Any other blogs or videos or suggested readings you want to recommend to us as we get ready for your workshop?
Well, Yeah, I mean, like if you just go to microservices.io, yeah, there's a tremendous amount of content there, and you can read about the design process. And then there's also premium.microservices.io, where for a modest subscription fee, you can read some whole bunch of sort of practical articles about the challenges that engineering leaders face and how to solve them. Oh yeah, that's like one of the components, one of the articles, and you can click through to the other ones on dark energy, dark matter.
Awesome. So, well, thanks a lot, Chris. Anything else you would like to add before we close?
No, I hope folks will sign up for the workshop. I'm looking forward to it.
So again, we'll see you next November. I'm gonna drop the link here as well. 20th, 21st, 22nd of November. Just give me a second. In Milan. Make sure you check it out. And for any questions, drop us a line. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
To the next one. Bye-bye.